Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to virtual Weber Center programming. I'm Janet Doyle. I'm the director here at Weber Center, and I'm happy to welcome all of you who are tuning in either on campus or through your own devices, wherever you are. So we're especially delighted and happy to have Dr. Kathryn Getek Soltis with us this evening to talk about an issue that oftentimes is not on our radar when we deal with peace and justice issues, and that is prison reform. So we're really anxious to hear her. We've had a lot of response to this talk tonight. As usual, she will talk for the next 50 minutes to an hour, and then we will open up the phones and our email. That information will be on the screen, and you can certainly join the conversation. So without further ado, Angela Susala will introduce our speaker.
Dr. Kathryn Getek Soltis is director of the Center for Peace and Justice Education and assistant professor of Christian ethics at Villanova University. Her areas of research include the Catholic social tradition, mass incarceration, and family ethics. Her publications include articles in the Journal of Catholic Social Thought, Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics, and a co-edited volume, Virtue and the Moral Life, Theological and Philosophical Perspectives. She served for several years as the lay Catholic chaplain in Suffolk County House of Corrections in Boston, and is a volunteer prison minister in the Philadelphia prison system. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kathryn Getek Soltis.
Thank you so much. I want to give special thanks to all those who made tonight possible, to Sister Janet Doyle, Sister Chris Matthews, and the entire Weber Center team. Thank you for the generous invitation. It's really a joy and privilege to be here this evening. I have to say that being the second day of Lent, it relieves a bit of the pressure for this talk. If you find it interesting and a good use of your evening, then I'm delighted. On the other hand, if you find it unpleasant and dull, you can include it in your mix of Lenten penance and fasting. So it's a win either way. I make light of this Lenten timing, but it actually does feel appropriate for this talk. When I was serving as a lay Catholic chaplain in the House of Correction in Boston, some of my most lasting memories came from this liturgical season. In fact, Ash Wednesday was always my favorite day in the facility. I would spend the day going through every unit offering ashes. Sometimes I'd be in the common space, but other times I would go cell to cell. For those in solitary confinement, I would have to get down low to reach through the small metal slot in the door in order to touch the person's forehead. In a mostly colorless environment where every surface seems cold and hard, I was always struck by how soft the foreheads were. They were the foreheads of both those incarcerated and those who staffed the facility. And the power of our Christian symbol and ritual was breathtaking. With ashes smudged on officer and inmate alike, it was the one time there was a sign of the fundamental human equality there. Every other visual in the prison is intended to distinguish incarcerated persons from officers and staff. The clothes each wear, the places they are allowed to stand and to gather. But on Ash Wednesday, everywhere you looked, you saw ashes that marked a shared humanity, a shared call to turn from sin. Each no worse, each no better, all called to life abundant by the mercy of God. I think about the US criminal justice system, especially prisons and jails, through various lenses. As someone who has spent years ministering behind bars, as someone who has tutored and taught there, and as someone who has researched, written, and taught about prisons on the outside. I am not a criminologist, but a theologian. In fact, in college, I was trained as a scientist in molecular biology. But shortly after graduation, I unexpectedly stumbled my way into both prisons and theology. So I'll share a bit of what's emerged from that intersection over the last 20 plus years. Let's see. So tonight, I want to offer some theological reflections on mass incarceration in the United States. And I've structured this talk into three main parts. In the first, I want to think about the notion of justice and its theological foundations. In the second, I'll discuss the necessity and danger of Christian mercy. And in the third and final part, I suggest what all this means for how we respond as individuals and as a society. Are we called to radical rethinking, to reform, perhaps even abolition? As a starting point tonight, we must first attend to this idea of mass incarceration. It is mostly common knowledge now that in the United States, it imprisons far more people, both in absolute numbers and in rate of incarceration, than any other country in the world. In shorthand, the United States has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. Rather than a direct response to crime, the astronomical growth of incarceration in the United States over recent decades is largely due to policy choices. The elimination of parole and rehabilitative programs, the war on drugs, and tough on crime sentencing, including mandatory minimums and 3 strikes laws. Over 2 million men and women are currently incarcerated in the United States. When we add probation and parole, it amounts to over 6.6 million persons. 1 in 38 US adults under correctional supervision. We are in the midst of a phenomenon identified as mass incarceration. It is more than a problem of mere magnitude. Behind the shocking numbers are insidious patterns of social and racial inequality, devastating damage to communities, and a host of suffering families and children. Indeed, of all the statistics, the ones that haunt me the most are of the children. At a given time, there are 2.7 million children with an incarcerated parent. That's 1 in 28 children. For Black children in this country, that statistic is 1 in 9. 1 in 9 Black children at any given time with a parent in prison or jail. Sociologists Bruce Western and Becky Pettit speak of a newly created group of social outcasts who are joined by the shared experience of incarceration, crime, poverty, racial minority, and low education. It is a phenomenon, they say, in which social and economic disadvantage, crystallizing in penal confinement, is sustained over the life course and transmitted from one generation to the next. It's important to recognize that sending people to prison for punishment is a relatively new development. For most of human history, prisons were the place where people were held prior to their punishment. Michel Foucault has shown that over a very short period of time, largely in the late 18th century, imprisonment evolved from being one, among other techniques of punishment, to a universal penalty for all offenses. And even more important for our purposes is the fact that Christianity has played an extensive role in that evolution of the prison. The first use of the term penitentiary is attributed to Jean Mabillon, a 17th century French Benedictine monk, who identified principles of spiritual reform in the monastic prison, where there was cellular confinement and fasting. Sociologist David Garland has noted that as late as the 18th century, the Vatican prison served as a model for prison design in Europe and America. In the 19th century, the two prototypical American penitentiaries were animated by explicitly religious commitments. Eastern State Penitentiary reflected Quaker theology, and Auburn Penitentiary reflected Presbyterian and Calvinist roots. Theological reflection, therefore, on the prison has been around as long as prisons. And our language continues to bear that out. We call the unit cells because of monastic cells. And we talk about paying a debt to society. And very rarely are people talking about monetary restitution. We are talking about a moral debt. So it's here that our first main section begins. What do we mean by justice, and what are its theological foundations? In his book, God's Just Vengeance, Timothy Goringe argues that the satisfaction theory of atonement provided one of the subtlest and most profound justifications for retributive justice. This satisfaction theory understands the crucifixion of Christ as a necessary compensation for human sin. Humanity disobeys and incurs an enormous debt to God. Since God's justice requires that this debt be paid, God becomes human and pays on our behalf. Goringe notes that the theory emerged in the 11th century at the same time that criminal law took shape. The theological framework reinforced legal retributive thinking by demonstrating that sin and crime must be punished without exception. Penal theory and atonement theory, he says, reacted upon each other and led to the validation of violence in the service of justice. The rhetoric of redeeming blood legitimized violence so that prisoners could make satisfaction for their transgressions. As the criminal law became identified as an instrument of God's justice, there arose a certain mysticism of pain, offering redemption to those who paid in suffering and in blood. This retributive penal atonement theory has had a tremendous hold on the Christian moral tradition. And frankly, that's a problem. One theologian has summarized it by saying, while the theory of penal substitution is in many traditions of Christian theology, preaching, and worship, it is not in the Bible. Furthermore, it is contrary to theological and evangelical norms, making atonement something done to God and nullifying the central affirmation of God's gracious will to redeem the world. To put it even more bluntly, if Christ obtained salvation for humanity by enduring the penalty, then all we need is Good Friday. If it is by suffering on the cross that Christ pays the moral debt and reconciles God with humanity, then the story could just end there. Good Friday is the day of salvation, not Easter. So how can we talk about justice so that Easter makes sense? Theologian Christopher Marshall lifts up the scriptural tradition on justice and identifies it as the Hebraic covenantal model of justice. This justice is a saving, transformative power, intervening action on behalf of the poor and oppressed. It is expressed in faithfulness to the covenant, restoring the relationship between God and humanity. It moves towards shalom. Marshall explains, genuine justice, the justice that makes things better, is never satisfied merely by following the rules, however equitable they are, or by asserting one's legal rights, however fair they may be. It is satisfied only when relationships are restored and the destructive power of evil is defeated. And this requires a freely chosen relinquishment of the logic of and legal right to an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Pope Francis has said nearly the same thing. In his 2016 audience on justice and mercy, Pope Francis observed that retributive justice does not lead to true justice, because in reality, it does not conquer evil, it merely checks it. Only by responding to it with good can evil be truly overcome. If the culprit acknowledges the evil done and ceases to do it, the evil is no more, and he who was unjust becomes just. This last phrase of Pope Francis is significant. He who was unjust becomes just. Much of the Christian theological tradition renders justice as a virtue, not a state of rightly ordered affairs, but the disposition of one's character, one's habit to be in right relationship. So it is less about achieving or establishing justice and more about becoming just persons. St. Thomas Aquinas gives the perfect example of this. His entire discussion of justice in his Summa is under the framework of justice as a virtue. We are usually familiar with the terms commutative and distributive justice. These are examples of the particular virtue of justice, but there's another version, the general justice or legal justice. General justice directs the individual's relations to the community at large. General justice is interchangeably identified as legal justice, since it belongs to the law to direct to the common good. All acts of virtue pertain to this justice, legal justice, to the extent that they are oriented toward the common good. In other words, if we are about justice, then we ought to be about fostering just persons. And yet, prisons give scant opportunities to exercise one's moral agency. I've seen firsthand the frustration of those behind bars who want to set things right, who want to contribute to the community. And yet that is not the concern or the interest of the criminal justice system. They are there to get their punishment, to get what's coming to them, to pay a debt by losing their freedom and having their relationships severed. Yet despite a system that has little interest in fostering just persons, I've met men and women who find a way. Here at a maximum security facility outside of Philadelphia, the men were hearing about the lack of funding and resources in our public schools. So they organized a collection of school supplies and sent them out for the students. At that same facility, they organized a peer literacy program to help inmates struggling to read, write, and pass the GED. And they found a way to start painting murals that now adorn buildings throughout the city. None of this is orchestrated by the prison, only allowed by it, and not easily or consistently. The prison is an institution that functions as a postscript to apparent justice. In the United States, we tend to see justice fulfilled in the correct verdict and properly deserved negative consequences. When a harm is committed, we typically measure whether justice is done by the proper sentencing. Our assessment is in no way contingent on what happens in prison, who people become, or the actual impact of the negative consequences we have imposed. Yet a Christian account of justice would suggest that when a sentence of 10 to 15 years is handed down and the courtroom reporter asks us whether justice has been done, we must say we could not possibly know for 10 to 15 years. The prison responds to people according to what they did. It seems unmoved and unmotivated by what people are to become. And yet the Christian tradition says that establishing justice requires fostering just persons. Our prisons adhere to a Western retributive notion of justice that renders each their due. And yet a biblical justice says that what is due is to act so as to restore the relationships that God intends. Biblical justice resonates strongly with the modern articulation of restorative justice. Restorative justice is pursued with the belief that crime and harm are fundamentally violations of relationships, not laws. It emphasizes processes that actively involve all those impacted by crime in an effort to set things right. It is constructive, inclusive, and seeks to respond to harm so that there can be accountability and, to the extent possible, a restoration of what has been violated and lost. As noted, there's still need for taking responsibility in restorative justice. So one might still say there is a moral debt, but the currency for paying it is quite different. In the retributive justice model, justice demands that the debt is paid, and suffering is the currency that pays the debt. Punishment is, by definition, against the will of the person who endures it. But in the Hebraic covenantal model of justice, that is biblical justice, the person must use his or her will, power, agency to try to set things right. For one glimpse of this, I turn to Danielle Sored, founder of Common Justice, a victim service program that seeks solutions to violence without relying on incarceration. In her recent book, Until We Reckon, she makes a clear distinction between punishment and accountability. Punishment, she says, is passive. We just need to endure it, the imposed suffering. We just need to not escape. It doesn't demand work or facing the impact of our decisions or taking accountability. And so in this way, punishment, prison, which gives punishment, lets people off easy. It also makes reckoning nearly impossible because prison takes away the very power people should be obligated to use to make things right. Among the stories in her book, she tells one of a young man who has been involved with gangs since the age of 8, who had witnessed, survived, and committed all sorts of violence. His arrest for a robbery and assault brought him to common justice. After 3 months with the program, he sat in a restorative justice process with the young man he beat and robbed, and with the man's mother. They were together for hours and reached agreements about how he could make things as right as possible. After the session, he turned to Sored and asked her if he could stay longer in the office. He said, "I just don't want to go back outside until my hands stop shaking. You know, for all I've done and all that's been done to me, I don't know if I've ever heard a real apology before. Do you think I did all right? This is the scariest thing I've ever done." Sored concurs. It is scarier and harder than prison. It's not violent and demeaning like prison, but it requires facing the lives of the one that one has altered and taking real responsibility for their pain. Prison takes away power, and prison distracts. Some commentators have lamented how much time is often spent behind bars trying to work one's case and file appeals. It appears to be the exact opposite of accountability. But truthfully, it's what I would be doing too. If I were caged, ripped from my loved ones and nearly everything that gave me meaning and purpose, if I were held under constant and sometimes capricious control of others, I would be putting all my effort into getting out. In my experience, those who have made meaning out of their imprisonment, who have undergone radical transformation even, do so in spite of the prison, not because of it. It speaks admirably about the human spirit, but it does not change all that is deplorable about the cages we maintain in this country. The fact is, there is a chasm between contemporary criminal justice and biblical justice, that Hebraic covenantal model grounded in restoring relationships. The difference between Western retributive approach to justice on the one hand and the Hebraic covenantal approach to justice on the other hand becomes clear in relationship to the concept of mercy. For a retributive notion of justice, getting what one deserves, mercy is the complete opposite. Mercy violates justice because it's giving what is not deserved. So one has to choose either justice or mercy. But for the Hebraic covenantal model of justice, mercy is not only compatible, but necessary. As Pope Francis has said, it is the very mercy of God that brings true justice to fulfillment. And so we turn to the second section on the necessity and danger of mercy. If we are going to get the justice of a criminal justice system right, then mercy has to be in the mix. We need to be conscious at all times of the human beings and the human suffering that are at stake. Some of that suffering is from the harm of crime itself, from horrific violations that we commit against one another. We must not lose sight of that. But other suffering is created, manufactured, by the ways we have chosen to address the harm through mass incarceration. Retributive justice and prisons are not inevitable for any society. They are our choices. As people of faith, we must invoke Christian mercy because we should never be satisfied with mere condemnation. In all situations, our faith calls us to seek a path of healing, hope, and reconciliation. We must acknowledge there are permanent, irrevocable losses that mercy cannot fix. But even in the face of unspeakable loss, Mercy calls us to respond in hope, not giving up on anyone, believing that our God is a God of salvation. Invoking Christian mercy in the face of mass incarceration is right, but it's also dangerous. I want to explore 3 reasons we need to be cautious about how we call upon Christian mercy. First, mercy is dangerous because when wrongly understood, it can make us see the world in terms of just 2 categories, deserving and undeserving. Just as we often default to a highly retributive justice, we also tend to see mercy as what is undeserved and opposed to justice. This common view of mercy is that it gives what no one has a right to expect. A person owes thousands of dollars, but we cancel the debt. We determine a person deserves a sentence of 10 years, but we let them out after 1. Conceived in this way, we must always figure out what is due before mercy can come in and arrange for something different. The common view of mercy depends entirely on a framework of deserved and undeserved consequences. But this is not a terribly good understanding of Christian mercy. Moral theologian James Keenan has defined mercy as the willingness to enter into the chaos of another. We let the chaos of another person's life, their problems, their suffering, their crises, be our own. It is based on what a person needs, not what they deserve because of their actions and choices. To enter into another's chaos does not require a distinction between those who have had chaos imposed on them and those who have created their own chaos. To make the case more clearly, we can go to the Good Samaritan to show that Christian mercy is not, in fact, conditioned upon our guilt or innocence. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, a man of the law asks Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Ultimately, the one who is a neighbor is the one who shows mercy. It is the one who sees people cast into a ditch, left for dead, and then liberates them. Go and do likewise, Jesus says. I believe one of the best renderings of the modern ditch where we leave people for dead is the US prison. But this may not sit well with us. The man in the parable was victimized by robbers. Haven't most people in prison done something horrible to deserve to be there? Let us return and take a closer look at the parable. The fact is that we have no knowledge of whether the man in the ditch is innocent or guilty. We usually describe him as innocent, a man simply traveling the road, minding his own business when robbers ruthlessly attack. But that is our assumption. It's not there in the text. What if instead of minding his own business, that man was a member of the band of robbers himself? Perhaps he tricked his companions out of their fair share, so they took it all from him, beat him, and left him for dead. Why does the Samaritan not try to figure out whether that bloodied man in the ditch may have deserved his fate? What if, having been nursed back to health on the supreme generosity of a stranger, that man in the ditch returns to his old thieving and victimizing ways? I believe that the distinctive feature of mercy is not that it is undeserved, but rather what it intends to accomplish. The Samaritan man doesn't know who this is in the ditch or if he is to blame for his fate. The Samaritan just knows what he needs. Mercy seeks to bring the half-dead back to life. And mercy does this without being contingent on the innocence or guilt of the person, without making a determination of what is deserved. Mercy is such a profound commitment to liberation, healing, and restoration that it will not be swayed by the righteousness or culpability of the half-dead. But too often, we seek out the innocent sufferer when we think about mercy. The family who can't pay their rent after a parent loses the job from downsizing. The person struck inexplicably with a rare form of cancer after years of healthy living. Despite a conceptual willingness to see mercy as giving what is not deserved, we still tend to want people to deserve our mercy by being innocent and grateful. Some say the guilty sufferer must be addressed with mercy, with justice, not mercy. They say mercy only for those who suffer by no fault of their own. And at the same time, these voices praise a God whose mercy comes to us in the midst of our sinfulness. We are most conflicted people. And I think we will stay that way as long as mercy is ensnared in the calculus of deserving and undeserving. In some places, this has played out as authorities determine where incarcerated populations should fall in priority lists for COVID-19 vaccines. Faced with backlash for an initial policy that would have placed incarcerated persons above elderly and those with underlying medical conditions, the governor of Colorado tweeted, "There's no way it's going to go to prisoners before it goes to people who haven't committed any crime. That's obvious." We need Christian mercy, and we need liberation from our deep-seated inclinations to always ask about what people have deserved or not. The second danger of invoking mercy is that it does not force us to confront the difficult questions about how we got here in the first place. It would certainly be progress if we all agreed that Christian mercy should be shown to every single person in prison, formerly in prison, on probation or parole, etc. But it would also be a distraction. There are narratives about why people are in prison, that they hurt people, that they put the safety of the community at risk, that they violated the terms by which we all agree to live together. All of these assume a well-functioning, equitable society that individuals then transgress or opt out of by their behaviors. Individuals do make choices, but we do not have a well-functioning, equitable society. Whenever I point to social injustices and suggest that they bear significant responsibility in all this, someone inevitably counters that I'm trying to absolve individuals of accountability for the harms they commit. But it is not either or. Certainly, the Catholic imagination of both and can do its work here. The danger is that we become so defensive or overwhelmed by the social iniquities that we simply resort to the narratives where harm and crime always start with individual choices. But the reality, especially in the United States, is that the narrative must include the structural ways we have set one another up for suffering, the ways we have consented to the marginalization and criminalization of some of our own members. The narrative must include racism. The narrative must include hostility to the poor, especially poor persons of color. So with mercy, let's enter into another's chaos. But we can't stop there or be distracted by it. We have to ask hard and uncomfortable questions about the sources of that chaos, about the racial and economic injustice of our nation. We have to examine our own role in perpetuating that chaos or in failing to use our capacity to challenge it. I want to offer just a few snapshots for us to recognize the ways that social injustice, especially racism, that they are inextricable parts of the scourge of mass incarceration. Here in Philadelphia last week, data was released about stop and frisk in the city. Black Philadelphians are 3 times as likely as white Philadelphians to be stopped by police when walking or driving. Despite being frisked and searched at the highest rates, Black males are the least likely to be found with contraband. Only 1 in 8 searches of Black males is successful, while 1 in 5 searches of white males is successful. Mahari Bailey recounts the first time he was unjustifiably stopped by police. He says, they searched the car and asked, "Where are the guns? Where are the weapons and the drugs?" He said, "Dude, I'm in 10th grade." He described another stop years later. They came to the car and said the same thing. "Where are the guns? Where are the drugs?" He said, "Dude, I'm a lawyer." Bailey said he felt like police stopped him more often after he became a lawyer and his car and clothes became fancier, which singled him out. African-American adults are nearly 6 times as likely to be incarcerated than whites, and Hispanics are 3 times as likely. As of 2001, 1 of every 3 Black boys born in that year could expect to go to prison in his lifetime, as could 1 of every 6 Latinos, compared to 1 of every 17 white boys. This is a graph that shows differences between prison incarceration by race. This is rates of incarceration. So you would want to see these all at the same level. But you can see Black versus white, especially for men, are quite different. 1 in 44 Black men incarcerated compared to 1 in 255 white men. For those who want to explain these patterns away, saying that it simply reflects differences in the commission of crime, the data doesn't hold up. Drug violations are a particularly good example. Despite study after study showing that rates of illegal drug use are equal across racial groups, Blacks and Hispanics are significantly overrepresented in who is incarcerated for these offenses. The next graph is similarly telling, as it shows who is in solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is not a punishment you can be sentenced to. It's not reflective of the crime you committed. Whether you are in for homicide or check fraud, it is disciplinary infractions once you are in prison that send you to solitary, sometimes for years, in some cases, even decades. Again, Black men and women are overrepresented in solitary. You could see the grouping of 3 bars on the left is the total prison population, where Blacks and Hispanics are already overrepresented compared to the total population of the country. But the overrepresentation is further exacerbated when you look at the solitary confinement, and even more so for women, Black women, going from 23% in the total prison population to representing 40% in those who are put in solitary confinement. I could go on. The stories are ubiquitous. Every time I welcome a guest speaker to campus, a formerly incarcerated Black man who also happens to hold a degree from our university, he goes to the bookstore, and when he's looking through the aisles, he's being followed by staff. A Black graduate student running through the neighborhood or on campus for exercise has to go out and buy all the most obvious running gear because in his simple t-shirt and shorts, the police get called when he's running. What we are talking about is a symbolic production of race, the devastating linkage we have forged between Blackness and criminality. The American Psychological Association has published research showing that Black boys as young as 10 may not be viewed in the same light of childhood innocence as their white peers, but are instead more likely to be mistaken as older, be perceived as guilty, and face police violence if accused of a crime. We have criminalized poverty just as we've criminalized Blackness. After Michael Brown was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri, the Department of Justice released a report exposing how the city routinely and disproportionately targeted poor Black residents with high fees and fines on low-level offenses, and then enforced those debts through judicial authority, warrants, and incarceration. As of December 2014, over 16,000 people had outstanding arrest warrants in a city with a total population of approximately 21,000. 3 out of 5 people in US jails today have not been convicted of a crime. This amounts to nearly 500,000 people sitting in jails every day, despite the fact that they are legally innocent of the crime that they've been charged of. Most jurisdictions in the country operate a cash bail system, where the court determines an amount of money that the person has to pay in order to be released from detention. And that amount serves to ensure that the defendant appears in court for their trial. People who are unable to afford bail are detained while they await trial for weeks or even months. But spending even a few days in jail can result in people losing their job, their housing, and even custody of their children. Studies show that pre-trial detention can actually increase a person's likelihood of rearrest upon release, perpetuating an endless cycle of arrest and incarceration. And the cash bail system often leads to the detention of people who do not pose a threat to public safety. It's poverty that we are detaining. What all this means is that the prison is a place where we demonize the people that we have already abandoned. It is institutionalized hopelessness. As a society, we have in policy as much as discourse given up on young Black men, traumatized, addicted women, the poor, the mentally ill, and so many others. It is hardly a surprise that these individuals find their way to prison, where we impose labels and criminal records that ensure they have no future among the rest of us. The criminal justice system needs Christian mercy, but not in such a way that we avoid asking about the social injustices that have been both created and been created by mass incarceration. And when we do the hard work of confronting these realities, we realize how desperately we need God to have mercy on us all. A third and final danger of mercy is that it allows us to think of the prison as inevitable. Here, I think especially of Matthew 25 and the mandate to visit the prisoner. No doubt we need this call to the works of mercy. No doubt we need to be reminded that what we do to the least of these is what we do to God. But when Matthew 25 is our go-to passage for Christian engagement with the prison, we can easily regard the prison as an inevitable part of life in a fallen world, a necessary part of life that need not be questioned. We just need to do more to accompany the folks who reside there. Of course, for the gospel writers, prison of that day was rather different from ours. It was a place of detention, of holding, not the culmination of punishment. So we need to ask the question, is our modern prison actually inevitable? And more importantly, is it a legitimate interpretation of our Christian moral tradition? To be honest, I am not so sure. The prison functions directly through marginalization. Our language betrays that fact. We talk about people who are released as returning to society. We remove and exclude individuals physically, relationally, economically, and politically when we incarcerate them. Is this an instance of permissible marginalization? Is this a case of marginalization that is somehow beneficial and necessary? Some would say yes, but it's not clear that can be reconciled with Catholic social thought, which stresses the need for participation, for contributive justice in order to secure the common good. In the US Bishop's pastoral letter, Economic Justice for All, they state, persons have an obligation to be active and productive participants in the life of society, and that society has a duty to enable them to participate in this way. Theologian and social ethicist David Hollenbach has noted that the basic demands of justice require that members of society both possess and use their freedom and agency to build up the common good. The common good rejects the disposal of any members of the community. Marginalization, particularly as it is discussed in Catholic social thought, is a grave threat to the person, since individual flourishing is connected to one's relationality and participation in the community. In Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis is clear that the threat posed by exclusion, clear about the threat posed by exclusion and disposability. No one is useless, and no one is expendable. Indeed, in the context of his own meditation on the parable of the Good Samaritan, he says the following: the decision to include or exclude those lying wounded along the roadside can serve as a criterion for judging every economic, political, social, and religious project. Each day we have to decide whether to be Good Samaritans or indifferent bystanders. So if we are deciding to be Good Samaritans, to show mercy, to bring the half-dead back to life, unconditioned by innocence or guilt, then we have to question a system that operates from the myth of permissible marginalization. The prison as we know it, mass incarceration as we are living it, is not inevitable. So this brings me to the final part of my talk, where we try to figure out what to do about it. Where do these theological reflections leave us as a society, as individuals, as communities of faith? What is to be done? The call to prison reform is a constant call. Over recent years, it has been gaining political momentum and bipartisan support. Promising steps have been taken. Juveniles can no longer be sentenced automatically to life imprisonment. Various local systems have reduced their reliance on solitary confinement. We've reinstated voting rights for more formerly incarcerated people. And particularly in 2020, we have had more honest conversations about the pervasive racism in the criminal justice system. We can try to continue on this path of reform. But as some commentators have noted, even if tomorrow we release every nonviolent drug offender, every aging prisoner, and everyone who is in jail solely because they can't make their bail, and we should do those things, the United States would still have an incarceration rate an order of magnitude higher than its peer nations. Even if we move to less retribution and more restoration, are we just making a terrible system a bit less terrible? Prison reform demands an improved, downsized prison, but recognizes the prison as a necessary institution. The prison abolition movement has been with us for some time, largely a secular movement, and it concludes that the prison is so thoroughly flawed that it cannot be reformed. Abolitionists seek three things: moratorium, stop building new prisons; decarceration, release more people currently in prison; and excarceration, prevent people from going to prison, including the use of diversionary programs, decriminalization, and socially constructive work to meet the basic human needs of all. In his book, The Fall of the Prison, Lee Griffith shows how cages, prisons, and jails are biblically identified with the power and spirit of death and are irrevocably renounced. Scripture unmasks reality to show that prisons are not resisting violence, but are violence. Ultimately, Jesus' proclamation of liberty for the captives announces the fall of the prison. Hannah Bowman identifies prison abolition as an act of Christian discipleship. She says, prison abolition has the potential to transform not only society, but also the church. It forces us to grapple with the implications of the faith we profess and revitalizes our proclamation of the gospel as a hope for the world right now, not only in the age to come. I believe the time has come for communities of faith, especially the Catholic community, to consider moving from a stance of reform to one of abolition. That's a large answer as to what ought to be done. I also have a few other ideas, particularly for us as individuals. The first is something very basic, almost too obvious. We need to maintain the humanity of people who are or have been incarcerated. In a class I teach, my students can opt to go weekly to tutor at a nearby prison and volunteer with the literacy program there. And without fail, for those who are having their first exposure to the prison, there is a twofold realization on their first visit. One, they realize that the people confined there are human beings. Two, they come to realize that they were not expecting to find human beings there. That expectation, it plagues us all. We are regularly desensitized to the humanity of those incarcerated. Somehow being a criminal makes you an other. I ask my students on the first day of class, have you ever committed a crime? And if so, are you a criminal? They say, well, yes, I technically have committed some crimes, but I'm not a criminal. What do we mean by that word then? Why do we use it? When I protest some mistreatment and tell someone not to treat me like a criminal, what am I saying about how we ought to treat people who are so-called criminals? The prospect of sexual assault has become an acceptable punchline about what awaits you in prison. Somehow we can be outraged by the commission of violent, dehumanizing crime on the outside, but we shrug our shoulders and normalize it with our jokes for those on the inside. If we are maintaining the humanity of the people who are behind bars, how can we be so flippant about them getting raped? This is all so ingrained in us. So one place to start is to examine and change our language. Eddie Ellis, founder of the Center for New Leadership of Urban Solutions and a formerly incarcerated person, penned an open letter about our language that I quote here. When we are not called animals, predators, offenders, and other derogatory terms, we are referred to as inmates, convicts, prisoners, and felons, all terms devoid of humanness, which identify us as things rather than as people. These terms are accepted as the official language of the media, law enforcement, prison industrial complex, and public policy agencies. However, they are no longer acceptable for us, and we are asking people to stop using them. In an effort to assist our transition from prison to our communities and to create a more positive human image of ourselves, we are asking everyone to stop using these negative terms and to simply refer to us as people. People currently or formerly incarcerated, people on parole, people recently released from prison, people in prison, people with criminal convictions, but people. A second suggestion. As Brian Stevenson says, get proximate. And as his grandmother told him, you can't understand most of the important things from a distance, Brian. You have to get close. The walls of the prison don't just keep incarcerated people in, they keep the rest of us out. Until the day we can take those walls down completely, our job is to keep finding ways to make those walls more porous. To do that physically right now in this pandemic is nearly impossible, but you can write letters. And knowing just one person deeply impacted by mass incarceration can radically change how you think about everything. And there are formerly incarcerated people all over your community. There are loved ones of currently incarcerated people all over your community. Get proximate and get active. There are people out there organizing to stop prison construction, to deprivatize facilities, to eliminate cash bail, to rewrite mandatory minimums, to end the war on drugs. There are people actively supporting, employing, and empowering people who are newly released from prison and jail. Find them, join them. Where can you find opportunities to minister, to volunteer? Well, I'm going to make a shameless plug here. Try CatholicPrisonMinistries.org. This is the website of the Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition. I am grateful to be involved in this group and its twofold mission to promote ministry to all those affected by incarceration and to strive to create a more just and merciful criminal justice system. Here is a final idea. Make this a part of your spiritual practice. Give up dessert for Lent. That's dessert with one S. Our addiction to constantly thinking about the world in terms of what is deserved and not deserved. Find a mercy that enters into the chaos of another, unconditioned by guilt or innocence. This Triduum, think about the fact that the Son of God was a convict, arrested, detained, brutalized in custody. And he said that another convict would be with him in paradise. Are we really pursuing justice when we recapitulate the story of Christ's crucifixion, when we convict, arrest, detain, and brutalize the children of God? And remember, if justice is about paying back a debt through suffering, Good Friday should be enough for us. But I need Easter, and so do millions of people in this nation. Like everyone on this call, they need liberation, hope, reconciliation. I have had the distinct privilege of getting to know men and women who have survived their incarceration and found ways to flourish, inside and upon release. I will tell you that it's the closest thing to resurrection that I have ever seen on this earth. So let us be an Easter people. Let us take away the sting of death that masquerades as justice. Let us hear with new ears, see with new eyes, the true justice and mercy that God asks of us and that God promises to us all. Thank you.
Kathryn, we're going to open up for emails and phone calls for anyone who would like to ask a question, respond, provide a comment. You gave us a lot to think about.
Thank you. And look forward to the questions.
Kathryn, this is an email. At the beginning of your talk, you showed a graph which displayed an enormous jump in imprisonment. Does this climb correlate with the prison industrial complex where it is profitable to incarcerate? And would you agree that this model correlates with the advancement of civil rights, forming a new form of Black lynching?
That's great. Thank you. Sometimes we do put a bit too much stock into, for instance, the privatization of prisons. It doesn't account for a huge amount. I mean, in terms of the capital investment in prisons, you actually have to look at more things with even public prisons in terms of the contracts and who's running commissary and the food. So that the prison industrial complex is significant, and there are certainly prison activists who spend a lot of time talking about it. I don't think that it is a sufficient. It is a contributing factor, but it's not a sufficient explanation for. It's a bit of a perfect storm, I think, into why you see that huge jump. You have there's political expedience. It becomes very helpful to be extremely tough on crime. But I think that what the question referenced in terms of this idea of Black lynching is really significant as well. Michelle Alexander has in New Jim Crow has really laid this out helpfully. Brian Stevenson has laid this out within his Equal Justice Initiative, really tracing different forms of racialized social control that begins with slavery and then morph to segregation, Jim Crow segregation. And then as that becomes dismantled, morph into mass incarceration. And you can trace the way that criminality has been used to control populations, Black and brown bodies in this country. And so I do think that that's a really important part of the story. Again, there's pieces of it. There's this idea of profiting, right? There's this idea of, in terms of the shift, there was criminological data in the 70s that really turned the tide on the idea of rehabilitation. We used to think that rehabilitation was a good thing, and then it was proclaimed in a famous article that nothing works. And then we thought that what we need to do is make sure that people get their just punishment. There were concerns about sort of the indefinite kind of sentencing that was happening. And so there was a lot of pieces to this puzzle. But I think that it's important to pay attention to all these factors, right? How is it that people can be making money, right? And if people are making money, the incentives to keep it going and keep beds filled, what does that translate into, right? And then I think, again, putting the really important look at the narrative in terms of how our country has not moved away from a mentality in which we have a racial caste system, that right now mass incarceration is a primary way of maintaining, a racialized underclass. Thank you.
We have a call. Go ahead, Mary Louise.
Yes, I'm not a youngster. It's been a long time since I remember this. When did we stop calling it a correctional facility? I know it's not a correctional facility now, but when I grew up in the 40s, that's what we called it.
Well, they still are. I mean, you know, they're SCIs, State Correctional Institute. So that language has not actually, disappeared. I think that actually but when I mentioned at the end, you know, having to be really clear about what language we're choosing to use and the power of that language, I think that's absolutely part of it. Every time that we identify this as a correctional institution and it's doing correctional work, we're giving power to a narrative that is not true and it's really damaging. So, I mean, it's been interesting, like it was the penitentiary and then it became the reformatory, right? But we still have correctional institutes, right? I was at the House of Corrections. But, you know, in reality, we have inside these facilities, there's a huge split in terms of staff. There are staff who are dedicated purely to safety and security and custody. And then there are staff who are dedicated to social services. But there's not a lot of interface between the two. And so that's another issue that makes this a very difficult problem.
I have an email question. What drew you to this subject and your passion around it?
Thank you. I tell my college students, you know, when I was in their shoes, I never thought about prison. It was, you know, I have had the luxury. I'm a white woman of upper middle class upbringing, and so I have had the privilege of not having my life touched by prisons. And I do remember once watching something on 60 Minutes when I was young, and it was some interview with folks in prison, and they were talking to an officer who said that he used to believe that there was some good in everyone, but having worked in a prison, he now no longer believe that. And I remembered being horrified, not by him, but by this idea that, you know, could that be the case? Could there be a situation, a person where we would actually say that there's no good left in them? And so I remember it stuck with me, but it was back in the recesses, and it was during a post-grad volunteer program with the Franciscan volunteer ministry, that I got the opportunity to go into prison. And it was, you know, nothing that was on my radar, just, you know, that's why I say I stumbled into prison. And I met truly beautiful human beings there. And I was, you know, I mean, what that phenomenon I talked about my students, you know, like we're all taught that somehow those who are behind bars aren't quite people. And so I think that there's something really compelling when you go to this place that you realized you had all these presumptions about, and then you find raw, beautiful humanity. And so I think I fell in love with some people who happened to be behind bars, you know, as humans. There was a women's facility in Delaware. And then I became aware of the injustices and the suffering. And having seen that, I felt I had to respond to it. And so it's strange. Like, I'm not sure, you know, why this is, you know, emerged in my life in the way it has, but I just at this point feel that as long as there are prisons, I need to somehow be in them. And I haven't been able to be in them for the last year. And that's been difficult, but not nearly as difficult as what those who are incarcerated are facing right now. But yeah, I think that's part of it. And I'm a mother now. I have 3 young kids, and I talk to them all the time about prisons and how we can't, you know, I don't want them to think that there are bad people. So much of children's literature and stories are about the good guys and the bad guys. And they hear from me a lot about how that's not acceptable, right? That every single person has been created by God and has hope, and we all, are a mix of good choices and bad choices. So I think now it's morphed also in terms of, I want to parent the next generation to have different ways of thinking about, what it means to incarcerate people and the people who are subjected to it. Thanks.
Another email. Thank you for your presentation. The Netflix documentary 13th raises many of the same issues that your talk did. 2 questions. At one time, there were mandatory sentences that took the length of time out of the judge's hands. Is that still true? And another question, what about for-profit prisons that need to be filled in order to make money?
Thanks. Yeah. So I'll take the first question about the judicial discretion being lost. And I mean, that is, there's some ways that mandatory minimums have maybe been reduced here and there, but it's still a huge issue. And in many ways, the balance of power is often found with the prosecutors right now in terms of what charges they bring about. And the other pieces of this that's, I think, really significant that we sometimes don't realize is that the vast majority of cases are not settled by a trial. They're settled by plea bargains. And in fact, one prison activist has suggested that if everyone refused to take plea bargains, we would crash the system. And we would, because the system could not possibly move forward with the load of cases if everyone went to trial. And so the negotiations in terms of what people get charged with, and then what the sentences for that would be, those negotiations are really significant, and a lot of folks who don't have access to good counsel are made very vulnerable. So I think that there are still significant problems with discretion being taken away. I think there's been more attention to that recently, but it wouldn't say that's a fixed problem. And in terms of for-profit prisons, again, I think they don't, the vast majority of prisons are still run by public facilities, but by states, but it is problematic, right, to have a bottom line running things. And so there are a lot of folks who are we have a facility here in my county that's privately run, and there's been a lot of efforts to try to change that. I do think that the idea of profiting off of this human tragedy is really problematic. And typically what happens is that the ways that you make it profitable are to cut staffing short and cut training short. And so you find ways that are not conducive. I mean, we already have problems in the conditions and the staffing. And so to cut corners there makes it dangerous for everyone, people who work there and the people who are forced to live there. So I don't think there's a legitimate place for profit prisons. And the more that we demand, there's divestment efforts that are being made to try to get different, like Geo Group would be one famous one. But the other thing is that it's not just the for-profit prisons. There are lots of companies that profit from running the phones system or running the commissary or running the food in a public facility. So there's more to the profit than just the prisons that are for profit, and all that is really problematic in terms of what it incentivizes people to, what kind of policies incentivize people to support. Sorry about the ringing. Today is a snow day, so I was not able to get into the office. I am in my house, and we have a landline. And, and I think my husband's putting everyone to bed, so I'm not sure if he's going to pick that up. All right.
This is a reference to a CNN program that was on a couple of years ago on Sunday night, Van Jones on restorative justice. As far as I know, that was the only presentation of such a procedure. It seems to be labor intensive. Do you think that's happening in other places?
In terms of restorative justice is actually gaining a lot of ground in both faith-based communities and secular communities. So the Common Justice organization I refer to that Danielle Sored has founded in New York is based on restorative justice principles. The Catholic Mobilizing Network, which does a lot of advocacy against the death penalty for the Catholic Church, is also equally committed to promoting restorative justice. And they have a ton of great information on their website and have organized a lot of conferences. There's a network of restorative justice with Catholic colleges and universities. It's actually really significant how that field is growing. And it's not just in application to criminal justice. There's a lot of applications to educational settings. There's, there are a lot of trainings and workshops going on right now related to dealing with sexual assault on college campuses using the restorative processes. There's some just great materials out there, podcasts and films and so forth. So I think that there's a lot of hope in that. It is intensive work. It takes a lot more effort and community involvement. I mean, we tend to think of our as citizens, our responsibility to contribute to the criminal processes, through jury duty. What a world it would be if we could all possibly get duties to report to a restorative justice process. So there's quite a lot. It's been going on for a while, and it's increasingly becoming more popular. I also Eastern Mennonite University has a long-standing program on restorative justice and some degree programs there. And yeah, there's a lot out there. So and most folks who are promoting some sort of abolition are pointing toward the power of restorative justice as a way to still maintain accountability, right? It's not okay. The harms that people experience cannot be left unaddressed, cannot be ignored. But the spaces that we create to address those harms have to be ones that they're dignified for everyone in them. So there's a lot that one can find, and if you want to reach out to me with any questions, I'm happy to send folks some resources. Thanks.
Maybe we'll wait a minute or two and see if there are any others.
Sure.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. In my own experience, having had a brother who was imprisoned, I find that the biggest problem to getting to justice is equivalent to the problem we have with racism, that until the attitude of one is changed, that the individual is a human being first, who has been created by God and who is loved by God. And people who do not understand that, who have not been touched
by either their own experience in being involved with a prisoner or having relatives in prison, do they get to that attitude? It is alarming to see the hatred. And the hatred is as strong as it is with racism. And the effort and energy it takes to break down that attitude, I don't know where the hope in that is. Because it multiplies faster than what you can do to build it down. Or break it down, I should say.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. No, I think what you said is so wise. And, you know, my students experience this when they go into the prison, and their families are very concerned about them volunteering there, have a lot of, you know, perceptions about what you know, the dangers are and the dangerous people that they will be encountering. And I have talked to a lot of my students who have struggled because it's hard to communicate. Just as you said, you know, if you have not had the experience of knowing someone, of encountering, right? Pope Francis talks about the importance of encounter. If you don't have that actual experience, it's hard to figure out how to dismantle that knee-jerk hatred and fear. And, you know, I think it's true. Michelle Alexander says, you know, that felons, you know, are, you know, people who are incarcerated are the one category of people that we're allowed to publicly hate, maybe even more so than, you know, racism. We're supposed to, you know, maybe hide that a little, although I think that's been put in the open air a bit more. But yeah, the sort of the permissibility of and the hostility is stunning. And I mean, I guess your important question about like, where is the hope because of you know, the virulence of that hatred and contempt. And, you know, this is, I guess, where I go back to figuring out how to make those walls porous, because I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's true. Like, unless we are impacted, unless we know human beings, we stay too far away from this. This is the Brian Stevenson point of getting proximate. Like there's not a very good substitute, which is good news and bad news, right? There's not a good substitute for knowing human beings. And so figuring out how to make those who are in our community formerly incarcerated, make them more visible, make that less a stigma. I mean, make that a cause for celebration of what they have accomplished. You know, I mean, if we actually thought that prison corrected people, then we wouldn't be afraid of people who came out of prison. But we don't actually have any faith that prison does anything positive. In fact, even if we know that someone was innocent, right? And Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy, he talks about how Walter McMillan, you know, was in this nursing home, and the nurse said, you know, how concerned people were knowing that he came from prison, and said, oh, well, Brian Stevenson says, but the state said he was innocent. He's been exonerated. And he said, it's not whether they committed a crime. It's just the experience what that person experienced in prison makes them dangerous and scary, right? What the institution we have created is what actually makes people scary. I mean, it's a huge obstacle, right? But you know, it's sort of the work one at a time. You know, the number of students that have gone into the prison, you know, each one of them has given me hope, and the way that they talk about it to other people. So it's a long haul, but I think the more we're able to tell our stories and to not be ashamed to talk about how those stories have intersected with prison is the only way to liberation.
This is a remark. I'm sensing that the biblical admonition to visit the prisoner is more for the good of the visitors than the need of the prisoner.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, and in fact, it's true in terms of not just the Bible, but the contemporary, right? Because when I'm talking about students that have gone into the prison, I mean, they think that they're going in to tutor people, which they do, but they think that they're going in as the helper. And then they realize that they have been transformed far more than, whatever kind of literacy help they've been providing, to someone who's incarcerated. And, that's is a danger, I think, of mercy, is that to be merciful says more about you than it says anything about the other person. We don't know much about the other person. We need to be merciful. And I love Matthew 25, but I do get nervous about it as our go-to place for thinking about the prison, because I want to go to Isaiah and the proclamation of release for the captives, but I think there's something there in terms of visiting the prisoner. Is this about our own righteousness, or is this about all of us together finding liberation? But the fact is that until we get in, so there's wisdom in the visiting, right? Because that's that human connection. Until we have that human connection, we don't realize how desperately our liberation is dependent on the liberation of those behind bars.
I think that is a wonderful way to wrap this up. That their liberation, our liberation, depends on their liberation. You've really given us, I think, information, things that maybe a view we haven't had or realized, but a lot to think about just in our own faith and our sense of mercy and justice. So we're really happy that we had you this evening. We're grateful that you joined us, and we certainly wish you well in the efforts you put forth going forward.
Thank you so much. This has really been an honor, and so I appreciate just everyone being on the call and giving your time to this and letting me speak. So it's shared work, and it's an honor to be with all of you. So thank you all, and blessings on everyone's Lenten season, and safety, health, and hope to all.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.